The world calls it a water crisis, calls it geopolitical tension, calls it an astronomical phenomenon. 3 separate events, 3 modern explanations, 3 different departments of global news trying to analyze each in its own silo. But there is a document over 2,500 years old that described the 3 together in the same sequence as a sign of a single thing. The text is not vague, it is specific, and it is happening now. Put into the right perspective what is before you. Between 2023 and 2024, 3 distinct events happened simultaneously at 3 different points on the world map. The level of the river Euphrates recorded historic lows documented by satellite. Iran launched, for the first time in 75 years of the State of Israel's existence, a direct and declared state-against-state attack with 331 projectiles. And the moon appeared red in the skies of the Oriente Medio, Europa, and the Americas on dates that the astronomical calendar recorded with the precision of minutes. 3 events, 3 geographies, 3 fields of analysis that the world news treated as completely separate stories. No analyst put the 3 on the same table, but there is a text. The Euphrates is a river that carries in its length much more than water. It carries history. It is one of the oldest rivers documented by human writing. It appears in Sumerios records over 5,000 years old, in a language that the modern world itself took centuries to decipher. At 2,800 kilometers long, it rises in the mountains of the Anatolia Turca, at over 2,000 meters in altitude, and follows an arc that crosses Turkey from east to west, descends through Syria, cuts Iraq in half, and dissolves into the Golfo Persico after having irrigated what historians call the cradle of Western civilization. Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, is what exists between the Tigris and the Euphrates. It is there that the first cities, the first codes of law, the first systems of writing, and the first organized empires emerged. All the civilizational architecture of the West passed through this river in one way or another, and this river is drying up, not suddenly, in a documented, measurable, and accelerated way over the last 3 decades. The process has human and technical causes that need to be understood so that you comprehend the scale of what is before you. In 1976, Turkey began what it called the Projeto de Desenvolvimento do Sudeste da Anatolia, known by the acronym GAP, a water engineering plan of monumental proportions that planned the construction of 22 reservoirs and 19 hydroelectric plants along the rivers Tigris and Euphrates to irrigate the semi-arid region of the southeast Turco and generate electricity for the country's industrial development. The Barragem de Ataturk, the largest of these structures, was completed in 1992. With a storage capacity of 48 cubic kilometers of water, it alone permanently altered the volume of the Euphrates that reached Syria and Iraq. In the years following its full operation, the river's flow in those territories dropped by up to 42% compared to the historical average of the previous 50 years. 42%, from a river that supplies 60 million people. Syria protested, Iraq protested, there were negotiations, minimum quota agreements, diplomatic pressure in international forums. Nothing reversed the trend, and after the damming came the drought. The region comprising the southeast of Turkey, northern Syria, and north-central Iraq recorded, between 2021 and 2023, the most severe drought conditions documented in 70 years of modern meteorological records. Lago Assad, the largest artificial reservoir in Syria, built by the Barragem de Tabqa in the 1970s, fell to 32% of its total capacity. In points of the Iraquiano territory, the flow of the Euphrates reached less than a third of its average historical volume. 1/3. Riverside villages that had existed since the Ottomano period, some with over 400 years of continuous habitation history, were abandoned. Farmers who cultivated the riverbanks for generations saw the soil crack in less than 2 years. The bed, exposed by the receding waters, began to reveal archaeological structures that no one had seen in centuries. Cities submerged by ancient floods, ruins of civilizations that the mud had preserved for millennia, and that the receding waters returned to the world as if the river itself were exhibiting the layers of time it had kept. The Iraqiano government declared an official water emergency and projected that, without radical intervention, the country could lose up to 7 million hectares of arable land by 2035, an area larger than all of Irlanda. The world covered it as a climate crisis, as a water governance challenge, as a problem of managing resources shared between 4 countries with conflicting interests. But could there be a variable that none of these analyses included in the equation? The text of Apocalypse, chapter 16, verse 12, describes the following. The 6th angel poured out his bowl on the great river Euphrates, and its waters dried up, so that the way for the kings of the Oriente might be prepared. It does not describe the Euphrates drying up as an environmental catastrophe. It describes it as preparation, as the opening of a way. The language is not of punishment. It is of logistics. The river dries so that something can move where there was previously a water barrier. This was written more than 2,500 years ago, in a context where the Euphrates was considered as large, as permanent, and as unbeatable as the ocean itself. And the text describes exactly this, its end, as a sign that something greater is moving, as preparation for what comes next. What comes next in the text and on the world map involves Iran. The República Islámica do Iran has, since the Revolution of 1979, a posture of hostility toward the Estado de Israel that is not occasional rhetoric. It is state doctrine, codified and transmitted from government to government. Ayatollah Khomeini, who led the revolution and ruled the country until his death in 1989, publicly declared that Israel was an illegitimate state that must be eliminated. Each subsequent supreme leader maintained and reinforced this posture as a founding principle of the República Islámica. But during the first 4 decades after the revolution, the Iranian strategy was deliberately indirect, the proxy strategy, financing, arming and training non-state armed groups that acted in the geopolitical interests of Iran without Iran appearing as a direct belligerent. Hezbollah, created by Iran in 1982 in Lebanon, became the best-armed non-state paramilitary force in the world, with estimates of more than 150,000 rockets and missiles pointed at northern Israel. Hamas, funded and trained by Iran in Gaza, became the de facto government of a territory of 2 million people on the southern border of the Jewish state. The Houthis in Yemen, supported by Iran since the mid-2000s, control a good part of the territory of one of the most strategically positioned countries in the Oriente Medio. Shiite militias in Iraq and Syria, funded and trained by the Corpo de Guardiões da Revolução Islâmica Iraniana, operate with relative autonomy but real coordination with Tehran. A network of forces distributed across 6 countries built over 4 decades, with the declared goal of surrounding Israel from all flanks. 4 decades, 6 countries, 1 architecture. Then came October 7th, 2023. Hamas launched the largest attack on Israelense soil since the founding of the state in 1948. 1,229 Israelense civilians were killed in a single day, the largest massacre of Jews in a single day since the Holocausto. More than 250 people were kidnapped and taken as hostages into Gaza. Israel responded with a military operation that would become the most intense since the War of 1967, and what had been kept as a contained regional conflict began to contaminate the entire security architecture of the Oriente Medio simultaneously. The Houthis in Yemen began attacking commercial and military ships in the Mar Vermelho and the Estreito de Bab el-Mandeb, paralyzing routes that moved 12% of global maritime trade. Hezbollah in Lebanon began exchanging rockets with Israel on a daily scale, forcing the evacuation of more than 75,000 Israelenenses from the country's northern cities. Iraqianas and Syria's militias attacked American bases in the region more than 160 times in 5 months. The axis of resistance, the network of proxies built over 4 decades, activated all its nodes simultaneously. And in April 2024, Iran decided it was time to step out from behind the scenes. On the night of April 13th to 14th, 2024, Iran launched against the territory of Israel the first direct attack from sovereign state against sovereign state since the Guerra do Yom Kippur in 1973. 331 projectiles were fired, 170 Shahed-type kamikaze drones, 30 cruise missiles, and 131 ballistic missiles. It was the largest combined drone and missile attack in the documented history of the Oriente Medio. The response involved 4 simultaneous layers of defense: the Israelense Cupola de Ferro, the Arrow system, the David Sling system, and military forces from the Estados Unidos, the Reino Unido, and Jordania, acting together to intercept whatever came beyond Israelenenses' capabilities. More than 99% of the projectiles were neutralized before hitting targets on Israelense soil. But the point was not the damage, it was the message. 331 projectiles as a declaration of capability and intent. Iran demonstrated to the world that it is capable of launching this volume of weaponry in a coordinated manner, and that it will do so when it judges the moment demands it. It was not a miscalculation, it was a calculated demonstration. And the world called it a regional escalation. The text of Ezekiel, chapter 38, was written in the 6th century before Christo by a Jewish priest taken into exile in Babylonia, the geographical equivalent of what is now southern Iraq. Ezekiel recorded visions that describe with verifiable geographical detail a coalition of nations that would turn against Israel in a time the text itself calls the end of years. Among the nations listed with cartographic precision, the text mentions Magog, Roz, Mesek, and Tubal, regions in the extreme north of Israel that scholars of different currents over centuries have associated with the territory that today comprises Russia and its southern borders. And along with these northern forces, the text lists allies with nominal precision. Paras, the Hebraico name for Persia, the territory that today is Iran. Kukse, corresponding to southern Egitto and northern Ethiopia. Fute, corresponding to Libya. Gomer and Togarma from the far north, associated with the regions of the Caucasus. It is not a vague list of generic enemies, it is geographical, it is nominal, and Persia, Iran, is explicitly named, more than 2,500 years ago. After February 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine and found itself isolated from Western military supply chains, Iran became one of its main arms suppliers, delivering Shahed drones in numbers estimated at more than 3,000 units over a 2-year period. In return, Russia provided Iran with advanced military technology and consistent diplomatic cover in international forums, blocking sanctions and resolutions in the Conselho de Segurança. The military alliance between the two countries reached, in 2023 and 2024, the closest and most functional level the two countries have ever had in their entire modern history. The force from the north, and Persia by its side, written more than 2,500 years ago. Now lift your eyes to the sky. What modern astronomy calls a total lunar eclipse, and what popular language has come to call a blood moon, is the result of a precise alignment between the Terra, the Sol, and the Lua. When the Lua completely enters the umbra of the Terra, the planet's total shadow, it does not disappear. The sunlight that skirts the terrestrial atmosphere is refracted and filtered, and the red and orange wavelengths of the solar spectrum are the ones that manage to pass through the atmospheric shield and reach the lunar surface. The result is a lua that glows in shades ranging from burnt orange to intense blood red. Depending on the conditions of the terrestrial atmosphere at that moment, it is physics, it is predictable. Astronomers calculate the occurrence of these events with the precision of minutes, decades before they happen. And the Book of Joel, written around the 9th century before Christo, more than 2,900 years ago, records the following: "The Sol shall be turned into darkness, and the Lua into blood, before the great and terrible day of the Señor comes." The Book of Atos, Dos Apostolos, chapter 2, verse 20, quotes this same passage from Joel as a reference to signs in the sky. The Book of Apocalypse, chapter 6, verse 12, describes the Lua becoming like blood within a sequence of events that the text positions as markers of an era transition. 3 texts, 3 authors separated by centuries, the same image, the same color on the same celestial body. In 2014 and 2015, what astronomy calls a tetrad occurred. 4 consecutive total lunar eclipses, all of intense reddish coloring, all visible from Israel. And these 4 eclipses coincided with 4 specific dates on the Hebraico calendar: Pesach of 2014, Sukkot of 2014, Pesach of 2015, and Sukkot of 2015. The probability of 4 consecutive total lunar eclipses falling exactly on the same 4 feasts of the Hebraico calendar without interruption is calculated by astronomers at less than 1%. This happened. And it happened while the Estado Islamico controlled a third of the territory of Iraq and Syria, while the Iraniano nuclear deal was being negotiated in Ginebra, and while tensions in the Oriente Medio reached one of the highest points in recent decades. In October 2023, 11 days after the Hamas attack on October 7th, there was a high-intensity partial lunar eclipse visible throughout the Oriente Medio, casting reddish hues over the Lua in a sky that same week, illuminated the rubble of kibbutzim burned in southern Israel. In March 2024, a deep, penumbral eclipse cast a reddish color over the Lua, visible from Europa, Africa, and the Americas. 2 high-visibility lunar events in less than 6 months. In the same period that the Euphrates was at its lowest historical point, and Iran fired 331 projectiles against Israel for the first time in a direct and declared way. The text was not wrong. But to understand why these 3 events are happening at the same time, it is necessary to go deeper than the news reaches. It is necessary to go to the point where it all began. Not in 2023, not in 1979, not in 1948. It is necessary to go to a desert 4,000 years ago, where a man made a decision that made all the sense in the world and that generated a fracture that no subsequent generation has been able to close. The man was named Abrao. Later, his name would be Abrao. He had left Ur dos Chaldeus, in the territory that is today southern Iraq, less than 300 kilometers from the current bed of the Euphrates, by force of a call he interpreted as divine. He had walked hundreds of kilometers to Canaan with his wife Sarai, his nephew Lo, and everything they possessed. He had received a promise that the text of Genesis records with precision, that he would become the father of a nation as numerous as the stars of the sky. He had believed in that promise. and he had grown old waiting for its fulfillment, while Sarai remained sterile. 10 years passed after Abraham and Sarai arrived in Canaan without any child being born. 10 years of waiting within a promise that was not being fulfilled. And Sarai made a decision that was culturally reasonable, legally accepted, and humanly understandable within the context of the second millennium before Christo. Mesopotamica law, and Sarai was a direct product of that culture, allowed a sterile wife to offer her servant to her husband so that the child born of that union would be legally recognized as the wife's child. It was an established legal solution. Sarai offered Agar, her Egyptian servant, to Abraham. Abraham accepted. Agar became pregnant. A reasonable decision, a human solution to a human problem, and the beginning of a fracture that would last 4,000 years. Because immediately after Agar realized she was pregnant, the text of Genesis records something with surgical precision. She began to despise Sarai. It was not calculated malice. It was the instinctive movement of a woman who had been used as an instrument and who, by carrying in her body what the other woman could not, felt in the pregnancy something that transcended the position of a servant. And Sarai, perceiving this silent shift, feeling that the solution she herself had proposed had created a threat she had not foreseen, began to treat Agar with increasing harshness. Abraham was caught in the middle, and he took the path of least resistance. He told Sarai that the servant was in her hands to do as she pleased. Sarai afflicted Agar to the point of making her stay impossible, and Agar fled, alone, pregnant, into the desert. An angel found Agar near a spring of water on the way to Egitto, and what the text records was said to her is the emotional heart of the entire narrative the world is watching today. The angel said she was pregnant with a son who would be named Ismael, because the Señor heard her affliction. And regarding this son, the text of Genesis chapter 16 verse 12 says the following: "He will be a wild man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, and he shall dwell in the presence of all his brethren." It is not a curse, it is a description. The text does not say this is right or wrong. It does not condemn Agar or Ismael. It does not justify the expulsion or criticize it. It simply describes what will be. With the same coldness with that, a doctor describes the course of a disease that has already begun. And then it says, "Return and submit yourself to your mistress." Agar returned. Ismael was born. He grew up. Abraham loved him. The text leaves no doubt about this at any moment. And when Isaac was finally born, 13 years later, the son of the promise, the son of Sarai, the son who came when Abraham was 100 years old and Sarai was 90, the tension that had been suppressed by Abraham's love for both sons exploded silently and definitively. Sarai saw Ismael, who at that moment was over 16 years old, in a moment that the Hebraico text describes with an ambiguous word, metzachek. It can mean anything from playing to mocking or molesting. The text does not specify what exactly happened, but Sarai saw it, and she demanded of Abraham what the text records bluntly: "Cast out this servant and her son, for the son of this servant shall not be heir with my son Isaac." And the text says this was very grievous to Abraham because of his son, because of Ismael. He was his son. He had grown up with him. He had been circumcised along with him. He had been loved by him for 16 years. And early in the morning, the temporal expression in the text carries the weight of a decision made the night before in a night-long silence. Abraham rose and sent Agar and Ismael away with bread and a skin of water, only that, into the desert of Beersheba, an expulsion, with bread and a skin of water. Ismael and Agar wandered until the water ran out. Agar placed the child under a bush. The text says she moved away because she could not bear to see the child die, and sat at a distance and wept. Then the text records that Deus heard the voice of the boy, and the angel of Deus called to Agar and said, "Fear not, for Deus has heard the voice of the boy where he is. Arise, lift up the boy, and hold him with your hand, for I will make him a great nation." And Deus opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. Ismael survived. He grew up in the desert. He became an archer. He married an Egyptian woman chosen by his mother. He had 12 sons. The text of Genesis names them one by one, each becoming a prince of a nation. They are the patriarchs of the tribes Arabes. The descendants of Ismael dwelt from Havilah to Sur, opposite Egitto, on the way to Assyria. The Oriente Medio Arabe has, in its deepest and widest ancestry, the line of Ismael. Isaac stayed in Canaan. His descendants became Israel, 2 sons of the same father, of the same blood. Separated by a decision that began as a reasonable solution, transformed into domestic jealousy, culminated in expulsion, and generated 2 peoples who have inhabited the same geographical space for 4,000 years, without any generation having the capacity to touch the root of the conflict. Because the root is not territorial, it is not religious in the modern sense. It is familial. It is the wound of 2 brothers who never resolved what happened that early morning when one left with bread and water and the other stayed with the promise. 64 diplomatic summits on the Oriente Medio in the last 50 years. Dozens of peace agreements signed, suspended, revoked and renegotiated. Trillions of dollars in aid, reconstruction and military operations. And the conflict map of the region is, in its essential structure, the same as it was 4,000 years ago. This is not a failure of intelligence. It is not bad faith by negotiators. It is the repetition of a pattern that no negotiating table has ever put on the agenda because it seems impossible to put there. And it is within this fracture, genealogical, historical, irresolvable within the instruments of modern diplomacy, that the Euphrates dries up, that Iran prepares its coalition, and that the moon turns red in the sky. Scale the weight of what comes now. The text of Ezekiel, chapter 38, does not just describe who moves, it describes the motive. The coalition, the text says, will come to take spoil, to stretch out its hand over the inhabited ruins, and against a people who were gathered from among the nations. This detail is more important than it seems. In 1948, Israel declared independence and began the process of gathering dispersed Jews from around the world into their historical territory. In 2024, with more than 7 million Jews living in Israel, the largest concentration of Jews in a single territory since the destruction of the Segundo Templo in 70 after Cristo, this detail of the text of Ezekiel is verifiable in the present with demographic precision. The people gathered from among the nations, present on the map. And the question that no think tank puts on the agenda, no diplomatic summit includes in its schedule, and no intelligence report mentions in its concluding paragraphs is this. If a text over 2,500 years old named the countries that would form the coalition, described the geographical direction of the movement, identified the people who would be the target, pointed out the economic motive for the confrontation, and described in sequence the Euphrates drying up, Persia in confrontation, and the red moon in the sky, what else does this text know that the present has not yet seen? Technology has changed. Satellites monitor the level of the Euphrates in real time with precision to the centimeter, via synthetic aperture radar images captured at 500 kilometers altitude. The Iraniano ballistic missiles are guided by systems that allow a circular error probable of less than 50 meters on trajectories of over 1,000 kilometers. The telescopes that record the blood moon have temporal resolution in milliseconds and transmit live images to more than 100 countries simultaneously. The technical sophistication of the present is real. It is impressive. It is undeniable. And yet, the pattern that is drawing itself on the world map in 2024 is the same pattern described in texts written before Christo was born. This is not a technological coincidence. It is not that the ancients were smarter than modern civilization. It is that the pattern they are describing emerges from identifiable causes: geological, demographic, geopolitical, astronomical, rooted in real human decisions that had consequences capable of spanning millennia because no generation had the courage or capacity to touch the root. The root is not political. It is not geological. It is not astronomical. It's a fracture of origin that no summit can put on the agenda because it seems impossible to resolve what you cannot even name within a modern diplomatic protocol. The Euphrates is not drying up because the climate suddenly worsened. It is drying up because the water management of a 2,800-kilometer basin, disputed by 4 countries with opposing interests, over decades of political decisions that prioritized national development over shared sustainability, reached a breaking point that was predictable for any serious medium-term analysis. The process has human and technical causes, documentable. And at the same time, the final result, the river drying up, is what the text of Apocalypse chapter 16, verse 12, described as a marker of a sequence that has not yet ended. Iran is not in a position of direct confrontation with Israel because the last 5 governments failed in negotiations. It is because 4 decades of deliberate military capacity building, of funding proxies in 6 countries, of nuclear program development, and of ideological consolidation of a state doctrine that identifies Israel as an existential enemy created a trajectory with a predictable arrival point. The direct confrontation of April 2024 was no surprise to any serious security analyst. It was a matter of when, not if. And at the same time, this trajectory is what the text of Ezekiel chapter 38 described with the word paras, Persia, inserted into a coalition that the text positioned as an event of the end of years. The blood moon does not appear in the sky because astronomy became more visible. It appears because the physics of the solar system produces predictable alignments millennia in advance. The Babylonicos astronomers of the 6th century before Christo already calculated eclipses with the precision of days using the Saros cycle of 18 years, 1 month and 11 days. The phenomenon is verifiable, repeatable, calculable, and at the same time, the coincidence of these high-intensity eclipses happening in the same historical period in which the Euphrates reaches historical lows and Iran launches its first direct attack on the Estado de Israel finds no explanation within any of the 3 isolated technical analyses, 3 separate explanations, each correct in its field, and none of them answers why the 3 are happening at the same time. History has not advanced. It has arrived at the point the text said it would reach, and the most disturbing thing is not that this is happening, it is that it was written, and almost no one read it.